everyone, welcome to Chapter 8, which is all about political geography. I'm going to try to keep this chapter a little bit short. The last ones have been pretty involved. But we are going to be talking today about countries and borders. Here's a picture from Borderfield Beach, which borders Imperial Beach and Tijuana. And you can see the border of the United States and Mexico that goes right out into the water. So there are some important terms that I want you to know. I talked a little bit about this in the last chapter, but the idea of states versus nations. So states are political entities governing a defined territory. So this is often of what we talk of as countries. They're different from nations. They're different from subdivisions, right? Nations being a group of people, subdivisions being an area, a small area. Sovereignty is the power of a state to control its territory, its independence, right? Palestine is not a sovereign state. It's not even a really identified state. Taiwan is de facto sovereign. So Taiwan operates completely independent from China, but China still claims Taiwan as part of China. And most countries do not recognize the independence of Taiwan as a way to keep doing business with China, right? So de facto sovereignty is unrecognized but real control. Most places are self-governed, and then there is territoriality, which is a desire to control territory. Right, so you have nations that do not have territory, like the Kurds that I mentioned in the previous chapter, who are trying to get control of some territory. Right? But we are a world of states, right? And these states or countries have not always been here, right? Those borders have changed, those countries have changed. We think about how big the USSR was, and it included many, many countries that are now independent. When I was growing up, there were two Germanys. There was a West Germany and East Germany. When my parents were, well, my dad was born, before World War II, there was one Germany, and then after World War II, there were two Germanys, and now there's one Germany again. So nation states are an ethnic group, or a nation, as the majority in a state, a political unit, right? So think about Japan or Korea. There are very few true examples left. Several of them are in Asia. You can also think about Polish people in Poland. And what I mean by very few true examples, I do not mean better examples, but if you look at a place like France, there are a lot of people there who wouldn't consider themselves ethnically French, that have come from other places. And not just recently, but like over the history of France. So true examples: Japan, Korea, Denmark, Poland is one. Often seen as ideal, but that is not the case. That is from nationalism, like this idea that like we are the people of this land and this is our land and everybody else should not be here. But people and borders react to the movement of each other, right? So borders change, and based upon the movement of people, and people cannot move based upon where borders are sometimes. And again, some nations have no state, for example, the Kurds. You also have small and large multinational states, right? So a place like Cyprus, which is divided in a Turkish area and a Greek area, or a place like Russia, which is incredibly ethnically diverse, right? I talked about the Sakha Republic that is part of Russia. And these maps, again, I just want to talk about how they are always changing. We tend to think of the map kind of looking the way that it does now, of having it look that way forever, but they are always changing. States are not inherent. They are products of history, and who conquered who and who got to rule and who got to draw those borders. The trend now is towards more new independent states. So devolution of power, which means kind of more local power, and balkanization. Balkanization is the breakup of states on ethnic lines. This refers to what happened in the Balkans after the collapse of kind of the USSR and Yugoslavia, and so all of this fighting that happened and these countries that broke apart. There are fewer colonial possessions now. There was a time when, countries in Europe colonized most of the planet. Now it's mostly just some small islands. This is on the bottom here, the alternate universe North America, right? You can think about many ways that North America could be divided into multiple countries. For example, Oregon and Washington kind of aligning up with Canada and being part of a country called Cascadia. We have a ballot to divide. People were trying to get on the ballot Calexit, which was this idea that California would become its own country, which I think is highly unlikely. And then there is something on the ballot, though, to divide us up into 3 states, which I also think is pretty unlikely. But again, there's this trend towards going to smaller countries rather than larger ones. There are some issues with both large and small states. With large states, there is more area to govern. It is just harder for a central government to control a larger area. There is a longer perimeter to defend if you are a large thing. You have greater distances to travel to get goods across. And in the case of Russia, that is especially hard because its northern ocean is mostly frozen. On the upside, you have more resources, right? That has really been a boon to the United States. We are a gigantic country, but we had a ton of natural resources that we benefited from. Small countries, there are fewer people, and so there are fewer resources. This is the tiny country of San Marino, which is very, very, very tiny. It is hard to compete on a global scale when you are a very, very small country. You have less power. You tend to have these niche economies, like where your country specializes in one thing, which can be dangerous if that economic sector collapses, because then your entire economy is based upon it. But they're really easy to govern because they're small, right? Not big. You don't have that problem like you have in Russia, where you have this mass territory that you have to govern. So the importance of state shapes for governance and defense, right? We have countries of all shapes and sizes, and they all have their own kind of unique issues. We have compact countries that have a relatively short perimeter compared to its size. France is a very large country, but it is very compact, right? It doesn't have a lot of things that jet out from it. Elongated countries have a very long perimeter, like Russia, right? So you can imagine if you could smush Russia together, it would have a smaller perimeter and be more compact. But given that it is kind of stretched out like this, and you have a lot of peninsulas, they have more border to defend. Then you have fragmented, like Indonesia, which is an island nation, right? It's broke up in multiple chunks, and you can think about how hard it is to have a cohesive government in a place like Indonesia. You have a lot of different cultures kind of evolving almost separately in languages on these islands. You have perforated, enclaved, and landlocked states. So South Africa, which is over here, is a perforated one in that Lesotho, which is an enclave, exists entirely in the middle of South Africa, right? So Lesotho is entirely surrounded by South Africa, so you can imagine that is difficult for them. They have to have a very good relationship with South Africa. Then you also have landlocked countries who don't have access, which I don't have a picture of here, but landlocked countries that have no access to a seaport, right? So Ethiopia is one of these countries. So they have to have a good relationship with their neighbors in order to get goods from the sea. And then you have penne enclaves, things like the Gambia, which are just kind of like this. It's not technically an enclave, right? But most of it is surrounded by Senegal. So in these countries, you have issues of dependency, right? You are kind of always dependent on another country for something, and your relationships with that other country are highly important. And then the location of the capital matters for governance as well. Generally speaking, capitals are often, some countries have multiple capitals. You want capitals to be kind of geographically centered. So that way the central government can kind of reach all parts of the country, or you want it to be in a place of large population. So in Russia, right, Moscow is not centrally located at all. It's all the way over here. But this is where the majority of population in Russia lives. And these areas out here have a lot more autonomy. They are very far from the capital. When we think about boundaries and borders, there are cultural boundaries, which often are based upon ethnic groups. There are geometric boundaries based upon the geography. There are physical boundaries, such as the physical boundary between Argentina and Chile, which are the Andes Mountains. Rivers, mountains, deserts, lake. They can result in cultural boundaries because you have two groups of people that are kind of evolving separately. Not all borders are defended, right? We don't really defend our border with Canada. And then you have complicated cultural boundaries to boot. So these are a result of complex histories and geopolitics. So you have exclaves, where you have part of a country that is separate from its main body. So think about Alaska, right, as part of the United States, but it's way up by itself, bordering Canada. It doesn't border the United States. Or Nakhchivan, which is this little red dot here. So this is Azerbaijan. This is Azerbaijan. It is separate from the main part of Azerbaijan. And again, those enclaves, a territory of one country surrounded by another country. And sometimes results from attempts at perfect ethnic boundaries, right? These people identify as Azerbaijani. These people identify as Azerbaijani. And so these people identify as Armenian. But again, it's not perfect. Look at the ethnic boundaries here, right? So it falls a bit, but it's not like you have Armenians that are living in within this border. And these oversimplified cultural boundaries do not reflect cultural reality, right? You watched a video about who drew these boundaries and who drew these borders. It is these straight borders, always be suspicious of them. Generally speaking, if you have straight borders like this, somebody who was colonizing or imposing rule drew borders as just a clean way to divide things up without any kind of regard for culture or ethnicity. There are different types of government. They range from democracy to autocracy on a spectrum, and there are many, many in-betweens. Democracy, true democracy is where everybody votes on everything. We do not have a true democracy in the United States. We have a representative democracy. We elect individuals. We vote on certain things, but we elect individuals to go to the House of Representatives, which I'll talk about later, or the Senate, and pass laws for us. We elect a president to do that. Right? We don't just vote on everything. That's a true democracy. Some states are more democratic than others. California, we love to vote on propositions here. I'm from Connecticut. We hardly voted on anything like that there. And then autocracy being kind of a strong single ruler or a strong central government that's really controlling every aspect of life. Up until recently, there has been a trend towards democracy, but that is shifting a bit. And there are unique problems in the developing world. So you have institutions that were put in place during colonialism, which are kind of democratic, but then also kind of very corrupt due to the relics of colonialism. Or when you had the collapse of colonialism and independence, you had these autocracies kind of step in. And then you have kleptocracies, which is on that autocracy side of the scale. And kleptocracy, if you think about kleptomania, it is basically a stealing of the wealth of the country to benefit a powerful elite, right? And these are these entrenched power structures that are left over from colonialism. Colonialism was all about kind of extracting wealth from another place. You also have unitary and federal states. Mexico is an example of federal states, but unitary is basically a strong central government, period. And again, this is the spectrum. It is autocratic. It is usually small. It's usually pretty homogenous. Think about North Korea. Federal is subdivisions that can pass own laws. So in Mexico, you have different states. In the United States, we have different states. In Russia, they have different states, although Russia is pretty darn autocratic. Not a very good example of federal. But in the United States, right, you can pass different laws. You can have different ages to drive in certain countries, or this practice is legal in one country and illegal in state, excuse me, and illegal in another state. But they tend to be democratic, large, and diverse. Again, Russia is this weird case where, like, technically they have states. Some of them have a lot of cultural autonomy, but in other places they do not have a lot of autonomy at all. Then we have these supranational organizations like NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Basically, after World War II, all these people got together and said, hey, if somebody attacks one of us, they attack all of us. So these are international alliances. You forfeit some of your sovereignty with them. With NATO, not much. NATO is a military alliance. It's for mutual defense. You have economic ones like the European Union, which England is in the process of leaving the European Union. The European Union is an economic union. It's basically a market system by which goods and services and people can pass through EU countries, and they negotiate trade as one. It makes for easier trade. These organizations are generally growing in numbers, although I feel like, again, there's this kind of shift now towards more nationalist movements. Our current administration talks about leaving a lot of these organizations regularly. But there was generally a trend towards more globalization and more cooperation. And now that the United States is starting to pull out or talk about pulling out some of these, you see a lot of other countries just kind of acting independently of the United States, kind of making their own way. Um, the unification of countries is unlikely, however. Like, these supranational organizations allow cooperation based upon certain things, but without you having to become a single country in order to do it. And then there are other examples. OPEC is it's basically petroleum producing countries. You have trade in South America with Mercosur. You have island nations that band together in order to have greater political clout. The other thing that I want to talk about is just electoral geography, which is a little unique to the United States. And so how electoral geography works is elections are organized spatially. So in the United States, it is not the case that you vote and then all of those votes are counted, and then whoever got the most votes wins. We do it a little bit differently. But when we look at electoral geography, particularly electoral geography is not unique, but the Electoral College in the United States is unique. But when we look at where parties get votes, it tells us about cultural and economic geographies of place. We talk in this country all the time about red states and blue states. If you live in a red state or a blue state, blue being more for the Democratic Party, and red being more for the Republican Party, right? So Louisiana, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Iowa, Utah, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kansas, Nebraska, West Virginia, Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, red states, have a combined population of 37.5 million people. And in the presidential election, they get 82 electoral votes for those 37.5 million people. In California, we have 39.3 million people, so we have more people, but we get 55 electoral votes. And so, because a lot of it is dependent upon, like, you have a lot of states going into one population, and then as opposed to California, which just has a ton of people. So this is how you wind up with a presidential election, which we did recently, and this is not the first time it has happened, where you have somebody who lost the popular vote, but is able to win the election. But so when you look at this map, it looks like, okay, again, maps are important and the scale of maps is important, right? So if you say, okay, well, it looks here, the country looks very Republican, and then if you look at the presidential election by county, right, you can break it down even more, and you could see, okay, well, where there are kind of pockets of what would be considered more liberal places versus more conservative places, right? And a lot of this is based upon race and ethnicity and religion and the density of the population, right? So how many people are living here? Think about this map. This is just telling us counties. It's not telling us how many people live there, right? So when we think about how many people live in Los Angeles versus Imperial County, right? That's a huge difference. And it's also based upon age, right? And economic health, right? How well is a place doing? So generally speaking, places that were not doing economically as well in the last presidential election, who had not fared as well kind of in the process of globalization, tended to vote Republican. This map, which is crazy, basically takes those counties and those districts and colors them based upon who they voted for, but also gives you size for population, right? So when you look at the country here, it actually, it actually looks a lot more mixed and a lot more purple, right? So here it looks super red. Here it looks a lot more, it's just you have a lot of people, um, uh, people who belong to the Democratic Party tend to live in coastal areas and major metropolitan areas, but there are a lot of people in those areas, right? So beware of when you look at electoral maps, when you think about like our country and our country being divided politically, we're actually a lot more mixed together than a lot of those maps would let you to believe. Again, we have a representative democracy in the United States. We have two kind of big elected bodies of officials. We have the Senate, which every state gets 2 senators, right? Every state elects 2 senators. And the idea of the Senate is that every state in the Senate is treated equally. Everybody gets 2 senators. In the House of Representatives, it is population based. There are 435 total seats, but there are more seats in more populated states. So this is kind of a compromise that the founding fathers had, whether or not to create a Congress or a body of representatives that was based upon the states or based upon population. And so they came up with 2. Those districts for the House of Representatives are redrawn every 10 years after the census. And based upon the census, our Constitution says that every 10 years we have to count all of the people in the United States. And based upon that count, places gain or lose seats. There's a big hubbub recently because we generally do not ask for citizenship status on the census. We have not in a very long time. And the current administration wants to put that back on the census, which people worry that it's then going to lead to less people filling out the census because they're worried about kind of documenting their citizenship status. So when we look at, this leads to some like really interesting election results. So this is the 2012 House election results, right? So again, we look at the United States, right? Lots of red, less blue. But the votes, actually, if you broke down the popular vote for all House election results, you had almost an even split down the middle, right? So it really kind of depends upon where you're living and how districting was done, right? So in 2012 election, we wound up with 201 Democrat representatives and 234 Republican representatives, despite the fact that that is not very reflective of the voting at all. And then you might have heard a lot about gerrymandering. I'm going to have you watch a little video to explain it as well, which might explain it a little bit better than I'm explaining it here. But the reason that that can happen is from something called gerrymandering. So basically, it's drawing congressional districts in your favor, packing or cramming your opposition together, or breaking your opposition apart. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And I would also like to say that drawing districts is very complicated stuff. And people in power have typically redrawn them again so that they could get reelected easily. When you are the person in power, you get to redraw them. And I'm going to show you an example of North Carolina at the end where people sued, and now they have redrawn the districts that'll be there for the next election. But what happens is because the people in power are drawing the districts, there are actually really few competitive districts. A lot of them are kind of a given that they're going to go Republican or go Democrat. Gerrymandering is also named after this former politician who basically redrew the districts so he could stay in power, which that video you're going to watch will talk a little bit about that. But then you also have, so not only do you have this like this activity that's happening where people are drawing these districts in order to get the best advantage, but then you have self-selected clustering that's happening as well, right? If you are conservative, you're more likely to want to live in a conservative area. If you are liberal, you more likely want to live in a liberal neighborhood. So for example, Pennsylvania in 2012, you had almost 2.8 million votes cast for Democrats, 2.7 votes cast for Republicans, 18 House districts were up for grabs, and you wound up with an overwhelming amount of House districts going to Republicans rather than Democrats, based upon this gerrymandering, right? So Republicans got 13 and Democrats got 5. So this is a big argument that also is going to be up in the Supreme Court and continually comes up in the Supreme Court, and how do you fix this? Right, and so basically you have the link to the video here. I'm going to have you watch it afterwards, obviously, because it's hard to watch it while I'm talking. But, you have this political divide, and this kind of, this exploitation of that political divide, right? It's actually good for politicians if we are farther apart and more partisan. It promotes less compromise. It also, as a whole, leads, though, to like low approval ratings for everybody, right? Because now the people in the middle aren't very well represented. But it leads to really easy re-elections. If you look at the election cycle for U.S. House re-elections, right, a lot of people have a really hard time winning re-election because those districts just are not competitive the way that they are drawn. And you also don't get the best represents the people the best. And we can do better. This is my last slide of this lecture. But here's North Carolina. There's the old districts, and you can see they're all broken apart. And basically, the court said these need to be more compact. Like, you cannot have these crazy long things. But if you look at district lines, some of them are pretty insanely drawn. And again, you're going to watch a short video about that. And that is the end of chapter 8.